More than 70 years after the collapse of the Third Reich, the past continues to cast its shadow over the descendants of its main perpetrators. Grandchildren of key figures in the regime grew up unaware of the true weight of their surnames, surrounded by silence or distorted narratives. But sooner or later they were all forced to confront the truth. Colleen Bettina Quandt was 16 when she discovered that her grandmother was Magda Goebbels, wife of the Nazi propaganda minister and responsible for the murder of her 6 children before taking her own life in Hitler's bunker. Until then, she had lived as the heiress to one of the country's largest industrial fortunes, built during the regime's era. The revelation shook her. She converted to Judaism and distanced herself from her surroundings. Reiner Höss experienced his breaking point at 15. Raised in an environment that glorified his surname, he discovered that his grandfather, Rudolf Höss, was the commandant of Auschwitz, where more than 1 million people were murdered. He broke with his family and dedicated his life to speaking publicly, visiting memorial sites and collaborating with survivors. Jennifer Teege, an Afro-German woman, learned her story at 38 when she stumbled upon a book about her biological mother. Within its pages she found her grandfather's name, Amon Göth, commandant of the Plateau camp, infamous for shooting prisoners from his balcony. As a direct descendant of a Nazi criminal and simultaneously part of a minority that the regime would have persecuted, her identity shattered. Over time, she chose to share her story and transform memory into a tool for awareness. Though their paths differed, they all stem from the same origin. This documentary traces the lives of those who grew up unaware that their surname was written on the darkest pages of the 20th century. Between 1940 and 1943, Rudolf Höss lived with his wife and children within the Auschwitz complex. They resided in a spacious home with 10 rooms, bathrooms, a kitchen, and 2 forced servants, prisoners of the camp for being Jehovah's Witnesses. While his family enjoyed elaborate meals, coffee, and wine, he oversaw the largest extermination center of the Nazi regime from there. Höss was not merely a disciplined executor. He implemented additional measures to expand the capacity for mass murder. In early 1942, he was summoned to Berlin. There, Heinrich Himmler confirmed Auschwitz would become the core of the extermination of European Jews due to its railway location and the imminent construction of a crematorium capable of incinerating more than 1,400 bodies daily. The initial facilities of Bunker No. 1 were limited. Under his supervision, the so-called Bunker 2, also known as the White House, was equipped with 4 gas chambers capable of asphyxiating up to 500 people per session. The next phase was more ambitious. On the night of the 13th to the 14th of March 1943, the underground morgue of Crematorium No. 2 in Birkenau was used as a gas chamber for the first time. There, 1,492 people deported from the Krakow ghetto were murdered using 6 kilograms of Zyklon B. In the following weeks, Auschwitz reached unprecedented figures. In just 2 months, more than 320,000 people were murdered. At its peak, the camp recorded up to 10,000 executions in a single day. Höss managed to escape with a false identity after the war, but was located by British troops in March 1946. Handed over to Polish authorities, he was tried and sentenced to death. The execution took place in April 1947 by hanging next to the crematorium of the camp he himself had organized, just steps away from the house where he had raised his children. Reiner Höss was 15 when he realized his surname hid a story no one had told him. During a school trip to the Dachau concentration camp, he stopped in front of a sign mentioning a high-ranking Nazi official with his same name. It was no ordinary official. It was Rudolf Höss, his grandfather. That moment marked a definitive fracture. Soon after he left home, severed ties with his entire family, and never looked back. At the boarding school where he studied, the gardener, a Holocaust survivor, beat him upon learning who his grandfather was. Reiner then understood that for many, the surname Höss evoked not just a past, but an inseparable legacy. Once a Höss, always a Höss, they told him. That phrase stuck in his mind. His family did not share his rejection. On the contrary, they glorified the grandfather's figure and blamed the Allies for his execution. They denied the extermination, claiming Auschwitz was merely a detention camp where prisoners lived well. His grandmother called it paradise. His father, convinced that Jews were the true culprits, tried to impose that same ideology on him. He failed. For them, Reiner became a traitor. They called him the Black Sheep. Even decades later, some family statements maintained the same narrative. An aunt, interviewed in the United States, quipped with a phrase that reflected that denialism. "How can there be so many survivors if my father killed them all?" Reiner grew up in a country that during his childhood avoided discussing Nazism. In the 1970s, the recent past was a silent presence. No one wanted to stir it. But he refused the silence. He sought refuge in archives, scoured libraries, and searched for documents and testimonies. He spent years trying to reconstruct the truth on his own, without support or guidance. Confronting that legacy also meant bearing the reactions of others. When he said his name, it often provoked fear or disbelief, especially among survivors. But after the initial shock, many were willing to talk with him for hours. The dialogue, however difficult, became necessary. After breaking with his family, Reiner Höss refused to settle for silence. He decided to confront the weight of the past at its root. He visited Auschwitz, the place where his grandfather had organized and overseen the machinery of extermination. There, amidst ruins and memory, he took one of the most difficult steps of his life. It was in that same place where he met with a group of Israeli students. That encounter, as he later acknowledged, was one of the most intense moments he had ever experienced. A young woman gave him a small seashell painted with a blue Star of David. Since then, he has worn it around his neck, as a symbol of a memory he chose to embrace. His presence in Auschwitz was not merely symbolic. He accompanies survivors on their visits to the former camps, facilitates their stays in Germany, and collaborates in organizing commemorative events. During one of those visits, he shared space with a Muslim prosecutor representing Holocaust victims in a legal case. For Reiner, this gesture held symbolic value. It showed that the bonds between persecuted communities must not be broken by narratives of hatred. In his public appearances, he insists that the crimes of the past cannot go unpunished or be trivialized. He believes that warning signs remain present. He points out that whenever a group is targeted for their skin color, religion, or identity, it replicates a mechanism we already witnessed in the last century. He cites the rise of xenophobic rhetoric in Europe, such as the case of Le Pen in France as an example, and mentions without drama that his own daughter is married to a Muslim as a natural part of life. However, his path has not been free of contradictions. In 2009, he was criticized for offering his grandfather's belongings to the Yad Vashem memorial. Although he ultimately donated them to a historical institute in Munich, the episode left a shadow that many have not forgotten, nor has he. Reiner acknowledges that his grandfather's figure will continue to haunt him. He even sought out a former Polish prisoner who had been Rudolf Höss's barber, hoping to find, at the very least, a memory that showed some trace of humanity. He found none, but he pressed on. After confronting the legacy of Auschwitz, the narrative continues with another story marked by an even more striking contradiction. Jennifer Teege, an Afro-German woman, unexpectedly discovered that her maternal grandfather was one of the cruelest criminals of the Nazi regime. Her story, shaped by family silence and inherited violence, forced her to confront a past as painful as it was improbable. Amon Göth arrived in Krakow in February 1943 with a mission to build and run a new concentration camp. The chosen site was Plaszow, on the outskirts of the city. A month later, Göth led the brutal liquidation of the Krakow ghetto. Those deemed fit to work were taken to the new camp. The rest were murdered in the streets or deported to Auschwitz. Soon after, he also oversaw the liquidation of the Tarnow ghetto. His presence in Plaszow left a legacy of terror. Every day, he executed prisoners without warning. He shot from his office window if he saw someone walking slowly or stopping. He had 2 dogs trained to tear inmates apart and used any excuse to punish or kill. A cook was murdered because the soup was too hot. The maids assigned to his house lived in constant fear of being beaten or executed. Helen Jonas and Helen Hirsch, both Jewish, recounted how terror was relentless, even inside the villa. The hill of Hujowa Gorka, within the camp, became a regular site for mass executions. Göth imposed collective punishments. If a prisoner escaped, others were killed in retaliation. To those who survived him, his figure was the very embodiment of death. His cruelty was not merely a consequence of obedience, but a daily practice that combined absolute power and personal sadism. At the end of the war, he was captured by the Allies and extradited to Poland. In 1946, he appeared before the Supreme National Tribunal in Krakow. He was charged not only with running the camp, but also with personally ordering and carrying out murders, mutilations, and tortures. He was one of the first war criminals tried for systematic murder, with testimonies revealing the extent of his actions. He was sentenced to death and hanged in September of that year at Montelupich prison, not far from the site where he had built his camp. The image of Göth as a symbol of Nazi sadism became etched in collective memory, especially after being portrayed in the film Schindler's List, where his brutality gained international recognition. Jennifer Teege was 38 when her family's past burst into her life without warning. In a Hamburg library, among shelves she often browsed, she picked up a book at random. Its red cover caught her attention. She flipped through it without expecting much until a photograph stopped her. She recognized her biological mother, and in that moment she realized that what she held in her hands was more than a casual read. The book told the story of her family, and it revealed a name she had not yet connected to her own life: Amon Göth, the commandant of the Plazow concentration camp, her grandfather, the same man she had seen portrayed by Ralph Fiennes in Schindler's List, unaware that they shared a blood tie. The shock was immediate. Jennifer, an Afro-German woman, had lived in Israel, learned Hebrew, and built friendships within the Jewish community. Discovering that she was the granddaughter of a war criminal, notorious for his cruelty and for shooting prisoners from his balcony, shattered her identity. To him, I would have been a disgrace. He probably would have executed me, she would later say. Until that moment, her family history had been marked by omission. Her mother, Monica, had given her up to an orphanage a few months after her birth. At 3 years old, Jennifer was taken in by another family who eventually adopted her. She never received clear information about her origins. She grew up knowing nothing about her grandparents. Of her maternal grandmother, Ruth Irene Calder, she holds ambiguous memories. She was affectionate with her, but defended Göth until the end. She kept his photo on her nightstand until she took her own life in 1982. Jennifer recalls that duality as a conflict that shaped her process of understanding. That discovery split her life in two, not out of guilt, but due to the weight of a silent truth. From then on, everything she knew about herself shifted, and she began to view her story from a new perspective, not to escape, but to understand. The emotional impact was not immediate. For days, Jennifer Teege felt something inside her had broken without explanation. She cried without reason, felt irritable with her children, and a constant sense of emptiness prevented her from focusing. Unable to understand what was happening, she eventually admitted herself to a psychiatric emergency unit. The diagnosis was straightforward: acute depression worsened by a double wound. On one hand, abandonment in childhood; on the other, the revelation that her grandfather was Amon Göth. Her therapist, moved by the complexity of the case, guided her step by step. Jennifer found refuge in simple acts: running alone, reconnecting with her body, feeling the clean air. Each routine helped her regain balance, separating her present from a history she did not choose. The need to break the silence led her to take a decisive step. At Christmas, she gave her adoptive family 2 books, one about her biological mother, another about Göth. She discovered that her parents were also unaware. There was no concealment, only ignorance. That certainty eased part of the burden. For the first time, she understood that silence had also been imposed on those around her. Writing became her refuge. She began to narrate her story without filters, confronting memories with honesty. She realized the guilt was not hers, but the responsibility of what to do with her inheritance was. Narrating became an act of liberation. Each word tore down the wall that history had built. Today, her identity is no longer divided. She has decided that her children will grow up with the truth, without carrying what does not belong to them. "I want them to have self-esteem without needing years of therapy to earn it," she says. Her family history, far from being a stigma, became a tool for memory. Jennifer compares her experience to a tree. The roots cannot be chosen, but they support the trunk, and though some branches may be twisted, it remains the same tree. She accepted that not all pieces fit, but that does not prevent living with purpose. In her words, "I have changed, but I am still me, and I know who I am." Jennifer Teege's story healed a wound with words, but not all families chose to break the silence. Some protected it with discretion, even when the surname carried an inescapable burden. Magda Goebbels was far more than the wife of a Nazi minister. As a public figure of the regime, she actively participated in constructing the symbolic ideal of the Aryan. In 1931, she married Joseph Goebbels, the Reich's propaganda chief, with Hitler as a witness. From then on, their home became a hub for National Socialist power gatherings. The Führer himself frequently visited the family, showing particular affection for their children. The party's rise brought immediate privileges. Their home was redesigned by Albert Speer, and their environment became a showcase for the image the regime sought to project to the world, a united, strong, loyal family. Magda, moreover, received letters from German women to whom she responded as the feminine voice of the new order. But behind the idealized image, emotional deterioration became evident. During the war, she suffered several nervous breakdowns and periods of isolation. Though she privately expressed distrust in Hitler's rhetoric, she never distanced herself from him. On the contrary, she chose to remain by her husband's side until the end. In the final days of the Third Reich, confined in the Chancellery bunker, Magda made a devastating decision. On the 1st of May, 1945, assisted by an SS doctor, she sedated her 6 children with morphine and then placed cyanide capsules in their mouths. She dressed them in white nightgowns, combed their hair, and returned to the hallway with red eyes and an expressionless face. Hours later, she took her own life alongside Joseph Goebbels in the bunker's garden. For her, a world without National Socialism was not worth living. The suicide of Magda and Joseph Goebbels left behind a broken legacy, but also a powerful inheritance. Their only surviving son, Harold Quandt, from a previous marriage, was not present in the bunker. After the war, he became one of West Germany's most influential industrialists. Together with his half-brother Herbert, he inherited the empire built by their father, Günther Quandt, whose fortune grew thanks to his close collaboration with the Nazi regime. During the war, the Quandt family's factories produced armaments, batteries, missiles, and submarine components. Slave labor was used there. More than 50,000 people, mostly prisoners of war and deported Jews, were forced to work in extreme conditions. They also benefited from the systematic plundering of Jewish businesses whose ownership was transferred to the family. Despite the magnitude of these crimes, Günther Quandt died in 1954 without ever facing prosecution. The responsibility never reached the heirs. Harold Quandt left a considerable fortune to his daughters. Colleen, Gabriele, Annetta, Katharina, and Patricia received the joint estate after both parents passed away in 1978. The inheritance included shares in BMW and other industrial conglomerates. The management of the family capital was consolidated through the Harold Quandt Holding Company, based in Bad Homburg, from where the 5 women have managed their business interests to this day. Although they have maintained a low profile, the connection to the past has not vanished. In 2011, under media pressure, the family commissioned an independent historical study. The Scholtisek report, spanning over 1,000 pages, documented the Quandt family's direct collaboration with the Nazi regime. 2 family members, Gabriele and Stefan Quandt, publicly acknowledged those ties. The fortune was passed down, but so was the weight of the name. The Goebbels surname does not appear in documents, but it is ever present in the family's history. Years after Magda's suicide, her granddaughters still live with the material and symbolic consequences of that devotion to the regime. Colleen Bettina Quandt was 16 when she uncovered the truth about her grandmother. At home, no one had spoken of Magda Goebbels. The revelation was a profound shock. Years later, in a decision that marked her definitive break with the family, she converted to Judaism and married a Jewish businessman, a descendant of Holocaust survivors. While her surroundings maintained silence, she chose a new identity, detached from the ideological heritage she had inherited. Her sisters took different paths. Gabriele, the eldest, briefly turned to Marxist activism. Katharina dedicated herself to the equestrian world, Annetta built a large family, and Patricia studied molecular biology in New York. None of them use the Goebbels surname, nor do they appear in interviews or attend public events. They have opted for a discreet profile far from scrutiny. After their parents' deaths, the 5 sisters consolidated the management of their capital through the Harold Quandt holding company. From its headquarters in Bad Homburg, they meet several times a year to coordinate the administration of their assets. The family history, long written by men, thus passed into the hands of a new female generation. They not only preserved the fortune but multiplied it. Access to private archives remains restricted. There are no authorized biographies or accessible personal documents. The Goebbels surname does not appear in the business structure, but its shadow is ever present. The public distance contrasts with the private weight of memory. In rare interviews, some family members admitted that living with that surname is an inevitable burden. Magda is not just any name. Her role as a symbolic mother of the Reich and her final decision in the bunker are not forgotten. In every family meeting, in every succession document, that past remains latent. The fortune remains intact, protected by robust legal and financial structures, but among those who manage it, there are also those who chose to face the origin of that capital head-on. Colleen, with her conversion and life distanced from the surname, represents one of the few visible breaks in a family that otherwise has preferred to manage the past with absolute silence. While some families inherit fortunes tainted by silence, others live with surnames that marked history with blood. After the fall of the Third Reich, the Himmler name did not dissolve with defeat. It became synonymous with extermination. Katrin Himmler, great-niece of the Reichsführer, did not grow up in opulence, but under the weight of a lineage no one could ignore. Heinrich Himmler was far more than a high-ranking Nazi official. As head of the SS, he built the regime's most effective repressive apparatus. In just a decade, he transformed a unit of fewer than 300 men into a paramilitary structure of nearly 1 million. His influence extended beyond police power. From 1943, he also led the Reich's Ministry of the Interior, orchestrating an administration based on terror. Under his command, the mobile killing squads, the Einsatzgruppen, were formed, tasked with shooting entire communities following the German advance in the east. He also centralized the network of concentration camps under a specialized SS unit. Dachau was the first, in 1933. By the end of 1934, all camps were under his control. Himmler was not just operationally responsible. He was the architect of the genocide. He directly oversaw the expansion of Auschwitz, ordered the installation of gas chambers, and promoted the use of Zyklon B as an extermination method. Under his direction, millions were murdered: Jews, Roma, Soviets, Poles, and other victims of the regime. The industrial scale of the killing would not have been possible without his systematic intervention. At the war's end, he tried to escape. He disguised himself, hid his identity, and sought a deal with the Allies. He was captured by British troops. During a medical examination, he hid a cyanide capsule between his teeth. He bit into it before speaking. He died in seconds. Himmler's figure became one of the pillars of Nazi horror. His legacy haunted not only the victims but also his family. Katrin did not choose that surname, but she decided not to hide behind it. Katrin Himmler discovered her connection to the Reichsführer of the SS during a history class. She was 15 when a classmate asked in front of the entire class if she was related to Heinrich Himmler. Upon confirming the link, an uncomfortable silence followed. No one reacted, not even the teacher. The incident marked her adolescence, not only because of the shame but also due to the omission. The topic was never brought up again. Years later, after graduating in political science, her father asked her to investigate the past of her grandfather Ernst. In the archives of Koblenz, Katrin confirmed that not only Heinrich had been involved in Nazism. Ernst and his other brother, Gebhard, had also joined the SS. They were not coerced. They saw the family connection as a path to power and prestige within the regime. Her research uncovered concrete facts. Her grandfather denounced an acquaintance for having Jewish ancestry, thus contributing to their persecution. Her grandmother, after the war, sent packages to Nazis convicted of crimes against humanity. None of this was part of the family narrative. In her home, Heinrich was seen as a respected figure, not as the primary orchestrator of the genocide. The contrast between the official history and the family narrative became unsustainable. Katrin realized that this type of denial was not an isolated case. In many German families, the gap between what is acknowledged publicly and what is passed down privately remains vast. Collective memory is still shaped by inherited myths, stories of grandparents supposedly uninvolved with the regime, of supportive neighbors, of silences that evade the truth. Married to an Israeli citizen and mother to a son who carries both legacies, Katrin took on a difficult commitment. With her son, she chose gradual honesty, explaining not only what happened but also the role her family played. She knows there is no simple way to convey that burden, but she understands that hiding it only perpetuates the problem. After confirming that her grandfather and great-uncle actively participated in the SS, Katrin Himmler understood that the family's silence was not a gesture of caution, but a form of structural denial. The image instilled in her childhood of a cultured family detached from the regime's crimes could not stand against the archival documents. Heinrich Himmler had designed the extermination apparatus. Ernst, her grandfather, was not a passive bystander. He collaborated within the system. Gebhard, the other brother, followed the same path. This contrast between public memory and private narrative drove her to investigate systematically. Her training in political science provided analytical tools, but it was personal necessity that set the pace of her search. Her goal was not to vindicate or point fingers at the dead, but to dismantle the inherited narratives that still blocked a true understanding of the past. The result was The Himmler Brothers, a work based on primary sources, family correspondence, and official records. Through the book, Katrin not only reconstructed the political biography of her family, but also exposed the grey areas of post-war Germany, families that publicly acknowledged the Holocaust while privately downplaying it, generations raised on myths of fictitious resistance, and a society where the ritual of memory did not always involve a real confrontation with the legacy. The publication sparked immediate reactions. Some family members accused her of betraying the surname. Neo-Nazi groups threatened her for dishonoring the greatness of National Socialism. However, she also received support from readers who, like her, sought tools to interpret a silenced past. Today, Katrin participates in conferences, collaborates with historical memory initiatives, and educates her son from a clear perspective. There is no inherited guilt, but there is responsibility toward the legacy. Her work marks a substantial difference between acknowledging the crime as a historical fact and understanding how that crime was rooted in family structures that, even today, resist the truth. While some heirs of the Nazi elite lived under silence, Bettina Göring grew up with a surname that offered no escape. Her great-uncle Hermann Göring's name filled entire pages in history books. For many, he was the very face of the Third Reich's unrestrained power. A fighter ace in the Great War, decorated with the Pour le Mérite, he was also one of the most influential architects of Hitler's regime. Göring was not only one of the first to join the Nazi Party, but also the founder of the Gestapo in 1933, before handing it over to Himmler. His ambition led him to amass power quickly. As head of the 4-year plan, he controlled vast sectors of the economy, reorganized ministerial structures, and became one of the country's richest men. Hitler granted him a unique rank, Reichsmarschall of the Greater German Reich, above all other military commanders. Beyond his military and political roles, he was one of the 20th century's greatest cultural looters. During the occupation of France, he personally oversaw the theft of artworks. The selected pieces ended up in his Carinhall residence, an opulent estate turned into a personal shrine of plunder. His name appears more than 130 times in Allied archives on art theft. His collection is estimated to have been worth over $200 million. As commander of the Luftwaffe, he led the air offensive against the United Kingdom, but the failure in the Battle of Britain undermined his influence. In the regime's final months, he attempted to position himself as Hitler's successor, sending a telegram that was interpreted as treason. He was stripped of his posts, captured by the Allies, and tried at Nuremberg. The tribunal declared him guilty of all major charges: war crimes, crimes against humanity, conspiracy, and waging aggressive war. Sentenced to death, he avoided the gallows by ingesting a cyanide capsule the night before his execution. Despite his theatrical demeanor and penchant for excess, Göring was not a distant bureaucrat. His signature appears on the order that initiated the final solution. Bettina grew up knowing her surname was tied to the extermination. From an early age, her life began to revolve around that inescapable legacy. Having grown up under the weight of the Göring surname, Bettina soon realized that her family history was not merely a matter of the past. It was a constant conflict between two identities, her father's Nazi heritage and her mother's pacifist environment. At 10 years old, when her gravely ill paternal grandmother moved into their home, tensions escalated. That woman, close to Hermann Göring during the regime, denied any crimes of National Socialism. When a documentary about Auschwitz appeared on television, her grandmother's reaction was neither guilt nor grief, it was denial. For Bettina, this was unbearable. Soon after, she decided to leave home. She was 13. She fled without a plan, driven only by the desire to escape the burden of a name she never chose. For years, she sought alternative paths to shed that weight. She took refuge in communes, lived in countercultural communities, and explored radical ways to break free from anything that reminded her of her history. She experimented with drugs, engaged in intense and erratic relationships, and avoided any setting that tied her to her roots. One experience profoundly marked her. It was with an older Jewish man with whom she shared a brief but revealing relationship. When she told him her surname, he froze and showed her his forearm. It bore the tattooed number of a concentration camp. He was a survivor. Bettina felt an indescribable guilt, but he did not reject her. From that moment, she understood that not everything had to be repeated. During the 1970s, she lived in spaces where children of Germans, Jews, and Japanese shared experiences shaped by the post-war era. In some of those encounters, they simulated extreme dynamics to confront inherited traumas. Bettina recalls one in particular. She had to march like a soldier, while others insulted her with rage. "I felt a collective guilt I didn't know existed in me," she confessed. Her quest for freedom distanced her from everything, but even distance couldn't keep the ghosts of the past from reaching her, with inexplicable visions and an alien burden she couldn't ignore. After years of internal flight, Bettina Göring decided to sever her heritage in a literal way. At 30, she chose to undergo sterilization. It was not just a personal decision, but a symbolic gesture. She feared, in her own words, carrying the wrong seed in her blood. That operation, performed during her time in a spiritual commune in India, became over time a way of saying this far and no further. Her brother, also sterilized, expressed it with a phrase Bettina never forgot: "I have cut the line." It was not an act of melodrama, but a response to the invisible weight she had carried since childhood. The Göring surname was not just part of her documents, it was a constant presence that conditioned her relationships, her worldview, and, above all, her own sense of identity. Bettina rebuilt her life in Santa Fe, New Mexico, far from Germany and her family's silence. There, among Jewish neighbors and open conversations, she found a space for reconciliation she had never had in her homeland. "I, a descendant of Nazi exterminators, mediating between two Jewish families," she said with irony. She didn't see it as redemption, but as part of a deeply personal process that included sharing her story publicly without filters, without pride, but also without shame. She spent years grappling with a guilt that wasn't hers, but that she felt nonetheless. Speaking, writing, and exposing herself were her ways of stripping power from that legacy. In her encounters with children of Holocaust survivors, she didn't seek absolution but understanding. She maintained that it wasn't about erasing the past, but looking at it with awareness so it would cease to hold dominion. Sometimes she still wonders if that burden is inscribed in her DNA, if historical memory can be transmitted through the body. But over the years, she has learned not to fear that possibility, to view her family with less anger and more complexity, and to take control of her story from a radically different place, that of someone who chooses not to repeat it. While Bettina Göring renounced her surname in search of redemption, another family bore a legacy even more directly tied to the extermination. Adolf Eichmann, captured in Argentina and executed in Jerusalem in 1962, was not just a bureaucrat of horror, he was one of the Holocaust's primary logistical organizers. He began his career in the SS managing files on Masonic lodges, but his trajectory took a definitive turn when he was transferred to the Office of Jewish Affairs of the Sicherheitsdienst. In the mid-1930s, he coordinated the forced expulsion of Jews through administrative methods combining economic pressure and direct threats. With the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, that policy of emigration was replaced by systematic extermination. The Wannsee Conference in January 1942 sealed that turning point. Eichmann not only participated but also drafted the official minutes. His task was to calculate figures, design transport routes, and ensure that trains ran smoothly to Auschwitz, Sobibor, or Treblinka. His department centralized information about Jewish communities in Europe, organized the looting of properties, and coordinated with local authorities for each mass deportation. His role in Hungary was the culmination. In just 8 weeks, more than 400,000 Hungarian Jews were sent to their deaths. Eichmann directly oversaw every phase of the process, with an efficiency that astonished even his colleagues. He did not act solely out of obedience. According to witnesses, he once claimed that taking responsibility for millions of deaths to his grave gave him a perverse sense of satisfaction. For his older sons, that image was never accepted. Klaus, Horst, and Dieter grew up with a different version. In later interviews, they defended their father's memory as that of a bureaucrat following orders. For them, Adolf Eichmann was not an executioner, but a victim of history. This view perpetuated for years the denial of the horror within the family core. After Adolf Eichmann's execution in 1962, his figure left a fragmented legacy. While his older sons defended his memory with ideological fervor, Vera Eichmann chose a different path: silence. From her arrival in Argentina and throughout the decades that followed, she maintained a tightly controlled narrative, both toward her children and the outside world. In the family environment, Adolf was not a war criminal. He was Uncle Ricardo, a reserved man who spoke little and worked hard. Vera wove that fiction with conviction. She never spoke openly about her husband's past, not even after his capture by the Mossad. Her narrative included no trains, no camps, no conferences, only the image of a stern but devoted man, deserving of respect and understanding. For years, her children grew up in a world where the Holocaust had no face or context. The Eichmann surname remained hidden behind the facade of exile, and the details of the past were replaced by a forced normalcy. When their father's identity was finally revealed, the truth did not come from Vera. It was uncovered by others, and only then did she cautiously admit that politics had complicated the situation. In that climate of passive denial, the older brothers found justification to idealize their father. Klaus, Horst, and Dieter, influenced by an environment that never questioned Eichmann's authority, adopted a distorted view. They founded neo-Nazi organizations, promoted anti-Semitic attacks, and tried to rewrite history from Argentina, presenting their father as an unjustly condemned patriot. Vera did not participate in those actions, but her omission, her refusal to confront what the archives and testimonies revealed, upheld the structure on which that view was built. In her home, the crime was transformed into absence, the responsibility into emotional distance. Her silence was not neutral. It was the invisible foundation that allowed Eichmann's legacy to persist within the household, far from any critical reflection. Ricardo Eichmann was only 5 when his father was captured in Buenos Aires. He barely remembered a vague image of the man who one day disappeared without explanation. At home, no one spoke his name, and when he asked, his mother dismissed him with a "let it be." It was under the sofa, among hidden newspaper clippings, that he began to understand. The surname he carried was not just a detail, it was an inescapable legacy. Unlike his brothers, Ricardo never justified or defended his father, nor did he try to erase him. He did not change his surname, not out of resignation, but out of coherence. "Change my name? For what? You can't escape yourself or the past," he would say years later. He understood early that silence only prolongs the damage, and that knowing the truth is the only way to confront it. He traveled to archives, read orders signed by his father, reviewed deportation records. Not because he needed proof, but because he needed to own it. He wanted no one to be able to say he didn't know what his father had done. Ricardo never considered himself an expert on the Second World War, nor did he want to become a spokesperson for a history he didn't choose, but he accepted that silence was not an option. At a conference in London, he shook hands with one of the Mossad agents who had captured his father. He did so calmly, without hatred, like someone who has decided to close a circle without denying the horror that precedes it. He acknowledged that it would have been easier for his family if Eichmann had shown some remorse, but he didn't. And that made a fundamental difference. Ricardo did not cling to excuses like the "following orders" argument. To him, it was a sick way of thinking, typical of a system that chose to keep exterminating even when the war was already lost. Ricardo understood that carrying a surname does not mean repeating its history, but it does mean confronting it. That's why he chose not to erase the connection, but to expose it. He realized that speaking, researching, and not denying was his way of breaking the most dangerous inheritance: indifference. He did so not for personal redemption, but for those who come after. Because if he dares to say, "Eichmann was my father," perhaps his children will never have to say, "Eichmann was my grandfather." Throughout this documentary, we have explored what happens when the past does not vanish with those who shaped it. What we have heard is not the story of the guilty, but of those who grew up in the shadow of others' decisions. They did not inherit the acts, but they did inherit their consequences. In the case of each heir, a constant emerged: the silent impact of poorly managed family memory. Denying, idealizing, concealing, these are different ways of living with an uncomfortable legacy. But so are confrontation, investigation, or distancing. There is no single way to respond to a history that was not chosen, but there is an inevitable question: what to do with it? These testimonies show that memory does not fade with time. It transforms, is transmitted, or is silenced, but it does not vanish. And when it is not named, it returns from other places: in identity, in education, in relationships with others. Beyond the surnames, what unites all these descendants is a common point: the dilemma between continuity or rupture, between repeating what was inherited or redefining it. And in that often solitary effort lies perhaps the greatest value of these stories: not the past they carry, but the way they chose to confront it.